What's going on, everybody? This is Sean of Raw Select Music. I am back with another record recommendations video. 4 records that I've been listening to over the last month or so. Some that I picked up towards the end of last year, and some records that I ended up picking up earlier this year. All of them actually ended up coming out way before 2020, but they were albums that I dug enough that I thought I should share my thoughts and opinions of them with you guys and let you know why I think you might want to give them a listen. So with that being said, yeah, let's talk about these guys. Off, I'm going to talk about the record that I probably have the least to say about, and that's the Fitz Ambro's Doe Quarters, released in 2017 on All City Records. I believe Fitz Ambro is an expat living in Japan, beatmaker, has made quite a name for himself in the Japanese hip-hop beat community, has tons of releases on CD and CDR, which I didn't know was a thing, except if you look all over a lot of the different online record stores, you will see a lot of CDRs for sale, and I think that is largely relegated to the Japanese hip-hop and beat maker community. But with all that being said, what do I think about this record? I was pleasantly surprised at how hard this record hits. It's 14 tracks of just some of the best instrumental hip-hop that I've heard from a beat maker in Japan. The drums hit a lot harder than I expected. There's some cool sample chops, and probably the best reference point that I can think of is DiBiase's Sound Dimensions record. It seems like it has a lot in common with that. It hits hard, it's got lots of neck breaking on it, the drums are really cool, it has a certain lo-fi, as much as people hate that word, aesthetic to it. It doesn't feel underproduced, it doesn't feel overproduced, and the only real criticism that I'd levy at it is that it really doesn't do a whole lot to separate itself from all the other beatmakers out there, except that his tracks have a bit more oomph than what I initially thought that I was going to be getting from this record. So really glad that I picked this up. If you're looking for another beat tape to add to your collection, Fitz Ambro's Doe Quarters, it's a pretty solid record. Not like a super amazing, mind-blowing record, but definitely one that will give your neck quite a bit of a workout. So if you haven't given this one a listen yet, definitely give this one a try. Next up, another record that I really dig, although I don't really have that much to say about it, is the Mark to Clive Lowe Live at the Blue Whale, released on Mashi Beats and Rope-A-Dope Records in 2017 as well. And this is another really solid release from Mark to Clive Lowe. I'm kind of becoming low-key obsessed with his music. And how it differentiates itself from some of the more recent releases from him is it seems to be thematically based around doing covers of jazz and thusly sample classics. Looking at the tracks right here, you got L&H for Yusef Lateef, The Golden Lady for Sun Ra, and Swahili Land by Ahmad Jamal. All of them are very recognizable. All of them definitely do an amazing job of paying tribute to the original track, as well as the sample that made them more well known for a lot of regular people out there. And they're just really dope tracks. Specifically, the A1 and the B1 tracks on here are really epic and have these great movements to them, these great sense of dynamics to them, and there's quite a lot more groove on this record than I was originally expecting. There's a lot more of a hip-hop bump to this record than on anything that I'd heard previously from him, and I really quite dig it. Covers are really cool, and I love the sort of ode to jazz and hip-hop that seems to emanate from this record. It's just the only problem that I have with it, it is way too short. With only 4 tracks and clocking in at under 30 minutes, it feels like this is a small slice of what was a much, much bigger session. And as a result, it feels kind of like it's a slightly incomplete picture, which is not to knock what's on here because the tracks and covers that are on here are absolutely top notch. It's just a shame that the stuff on here, especially the A2 and B2 tracks, seemingly cut off just as they start getting good, and that's kind of disappointing, as I would have much preferred to get a double, triple, quadruple LP if it gave me the full listening experience. But as it stands, it's still a great listen. If you're looking for a great way to be introduced to the world of Mark Clive Lowe, Live at the Blue Whale is definitely a good starting point. So yeah, give this guy a listen too. Up Mr. Chop's Illuminate, released on Now Again Records in 2013. I picked this up on a whim just because I was a huge fan of the 2009 Pete Rock covers album that he did for Now Again Records, For Pete's Sake. I really enjoyed a lot of the extremely gritty, echo and delay heavy synth sounds from this record, as well as it just being a fantastic Pete Rock tribute album. I should probably do a review of this at some point. So kind of curious, just trying to hear what else Mr. Chop had in store. I saw it was cheap on Amazon, so I decided to give it a listen. And I gotta say, I do actually enjoy this album quite a bit, even though it wasn't quite what I was expecting. Giving the sort of more boom bap heavy sounds of the For Pete's Sake project, I was kind of expecting for a lot more low, mid-tempo, boom bap, hard break, drum stuff on this record, and what I got essentially is Mr. Chop's ode to krautrock. That's not necessarily a bad thing. I've always been interested in krautrock, even though I'm not very knowledgeable of it. Overall, it's definitely one of the more rock-heavy projects that I've heard recently. I love a lot of the synth textures on here. There's a lot of energy, a lot of distortion. It's definitely some real uneasy listening, as it is incredibly noisy and incredibly cacophonous, and I dig the vibe on here. Plenty of atmosphere. It's a little bit lighter on melody than what I was expecting, as well as it seems like texture is more the sound of the day. It's not the most memorable listen. I often do find that every time that I do listen to this, I end up sort of forgetting what it sounds like, and then I have to remind myself by listening to it again to really fully appreciate what's going on here. But it's not necessarily a bad record. I think ultimately at the end of the day, your enjoyment of this record is going to come down to your love and appreciation of krautrock, and whether you are expecting something more in that vein as opposed to something that was a little bit more on the funk and soul and jazz side of things, which this record really doesn't have that much. There are 2 songs on here that have that sort of sound to them, but ultimately I think where the album really becomes interesting is in some of the beatless synth-focused tracks on here that really just have that krautrock essence to them that are really the most interesting songs. So definitely not a record for everyone, not the most highly recommended record in this video, but still a record that I recommend that you give a listen to. So if you haven't checked out Mr. Chop's Illuminate, give this one a listen, but if you're looking for something a little bit more boom bap focused, definitely seek out a copy of this, as this is definitely the more recommended Mr. Chop record in my humble opinion.
So just raise your hands and hold.
Last up, we've got the record that I actually recommend the most. This is Frits Wentink, Rarely Pure, Never Simple. released on Wolf Music in 2015. I had heard a few clips from this record years ago, and I was a huge fan of Frits Wentink through his Falling Coconut EP that he did for Heist Recordings, because it was just such a unique and original slice of deep house. So digging around for more of his records, I had stumbled onto this and was quite surprised that there were quite a few hip-hop tracks on here. So being infinitely curious about this record for the longest time, despite the fact that it was nearly impossible to get my hands on it until it popped up in the used section of Disc Union, one of the places that I buy records from in Japan, I decided to go all in, pick it up. It was relatively inexpensive, and I gotta say, I've been kind of low-key obsessed with this. It's pretty much split into two equal halves. You've got half the record devoted to more neo-soul and hip-hop oriented tracks, and then the other half of the record is sectioned off into more deep house territory. What's interesting to me about this record, despite the fact that I know Frits Wentink is definitely more known as a deep house producer, his beats actually end up becoming the highlights of this. He does the Dilla swing like a lot of other beat makers out there, but does it in such a unique and different fashion that it really helps him create a unique and interesting voice, unlike a lot of other beat makers and producers out there. And there's just this really warm, dark, kind of colorless, but still very interesting atmosphere to a lot of the tracks on here, as well as a lot of the songs being heightened by the female vocalist who appears on a lot of the tracks on here, Lowe's Jungerling. I'm terrible with names. She really adds a lot of soulfulness to a lot of the beats on here. Singing's fantastic and really complements these tracks really, really well. In terms of the deep house songs on here, they're also pretty good. They've got that cavernous deepness that I really like about a lot of deep house. They've got plenty of groove. I do think they come off a little bit samey, which is why I prefer a lot of the beats on here, which seem way more varied in the different use of samples, keys, and drum hits. A lot of the deep house tracks do seem to run together a little bit, but thankfully with a lot of the atmospherics as well as the melodies, they do end up standing out on their own. And it's a record that's really addictive. I've found myself going back to this record over and over again and pressing play on it as soon as it's over. It's strangely a record that's at times very, very subtle and yet completely captivating. And also, at the same time, a record that can very quickly sort of devolve into background music, and yet it's still a compelling listen to whether or not you're fully paying attention to it. So at the end of the day, out of all the records that I've talked about in this video, this is the one I probably recommend the most. It might be the hardest to get your hands on, but that doesn't take away from the fact that Frits Wentink's Rarely Pure, Never Simple is definitely my most recommended record this time around. But that's going to be it for me today, guys. Thanks as always for watching. If you've checked out any of these records for yourself, please let me know what you thought about them down in the comments. If you want to hear any of these records for yourself, please head over to my WordPress blog, because that's where I'll be posting music links to any of the records that I talk about on this channel. As always, make sure you're here 8 p.m. Japan Standard Time for Live from the Record Room. There you can hear me play some of the records that I talk about on this channel, as well as a whole host of records that are in my collection that I don't get a chance to talk about in these videos. Links to everything, as always. But that's going to be it for me today, guys. Thanks as always for watching, and I will catch you in the next video. So until then, peace out!